The man who understands that is here with us today, the CEO of the great state of Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker.
Good afternoon. Thanks. Thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you. I hope everybody's having a great time. They liked it downstairs too, huh? Must have been a preview to the San Diego game, right? I saw Mark Murphy on the way in, and I said it's kind of nice to have a bye week because we can't go every week being completely undefeated. But the only one we're not going undefeated on is a week when we had a bye out there, so it works out pretty well. I said on the way in, I was in Sheboygan before this. I'm going to go over to Marinette afterwards, and it's kind of interesting thinking about it. I'm going to talk a lot about some business issues here in a moment, but what's particularly interesting to me is having a little bit of fun at the expense of some of the other teams in the Central Division. I said I used to tell jokes about the Lions, but you can't really tell jokes about the Detroit Lions anymore, so I got to apply them all to the Minnesota Vikings. So you know why the Minnesota Vikings don't have a website? It's because they can't put 3 W's in a row. Oh, it gets better. My apologies to anybody who's a Vikings fan, not for that joke, but just because you're a Vikings fan. But the other one I love to point out is why are the Minnesota Vikings and a car thief alike? It's because neither of them have a title. So it works out. That's one you got to think about for a minute. I said the other funny part is I was up in Hayward not long ago, a couple of weeks ago. We were talking to some folks about an issue we had at that point, and one of the guys had a Bears hat on in Hayward of all places. And so I said, well, you know, when I come to Hayward or Spooner or places like that, oftentimes I hear quite frequently from people who tell me, you know, they have problems with wildlife in their backyard, in particular bears, getting through their garbage and things like that. And I tell them, if you just put out a couple goalposts, you'll have no problems with bears in your backyard whatsoever. But all the appropriate jokes for the atrium here at Lambeau Field. But we appreciate Mark and the staff here with the Green Bay Packers allowing us to host all of you here today. I hear from the Lieutenant Governor it's been a great session. It's one of those where in the end, no matter what other voices be heard, the best voice we're going to hear from is the voice of small businesses here in the state of Wisconsin. From our standpoint, it's interesting. I get asked all the time by people, how are things going in Wisconsin? Besides the fact I love, you know, bragging up about the Packers and up until recently the Brewers and the Badgers as well, what we talk about more than anything is the fact that the reforms are working. And I want to share a little bit about that today and how I think it ties in with small businesses here in the state of Wisconsin. I just had a small business roundtable, much like Rebecca's been holding across the state with many of you here and many others across Wisconsin, down in Sheboygan. I'm going to be visiting a company later today in Marinette. And it's important to talk about what's going on because sometimes even in our own state we forget that the reforms we've acted on since the beginning of the year, and I say we because it's not just Rebecca and I, it's lawmakers. In many cases when it comes to jobs, it's been lawmakers from both political parties that have worked together just like we've done in the special session, just like we did at the beginning of the year. But we've taken aggressive action to change the business climate in this state. I mean, think about it. In the first month to 5 weeks we were in office, we went out and had a special session on jobs where we lowered the tax burden on job creators. We ultimately eased the regulatory burden, the litigation burden in the state. We still got a whole lot more to do, and I know you've talked already this morning about that. We did all those things, changed, I see Paul Jaden here, changed the former Department of Commerce and put it into the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which was about a public-private partnership to partner with our job creators, to put a focus back on the private sector creating jobs, not just the government. All those things ultimately have created a better business environment in the state. Think about it. The first 6 months of this year, we created nearly 40,000 new jobs in the private sector in Wisconsin. And there's a good sign we're going to see more of that in the future. I mean, think about it. 2 interesting statistics. One within the state. Within the state of Wisconsin, every year the statewide Chamber of Commerce does a survey of job creators. and they ask a series of questions. Last year, that survey showed that just 10% of all the job creators in Wisconsin thought that Wisconsin was heading the right direction. This year, several months after our reforms went into place, that number went from 10% to 88%. 88% of all the job creators in Wisconsin said Wisconsin's heading the right direction. Now, what's interesting in that survey was also the fact that of those surveyed, a solid majority said in the next 12 months they're going to add more jobs. Because that's really what this is about. It's not just about whether you feel it's heading the right direction, but what are we doing constructively to create more jobs in Wisconsin? The other interesting statistic was that over that same time frame, there's a survey done every year of job creators across the country. 500 CEOs are randomly selected from across the United States. They were surveyed later this spring, again, after our reforms had a chance to go into effect. And what they found was that historically we're somewhere between 40 and 50 on the rankings. 2 years ago we were 43. Last year we were 41. This year, after our reforms went into effect, we went from 41st state in terms of states to do business in, up 17 spots to number 24, the fastest increase of any state in the country. Now, why that is important is because we know, and we did a series of things. We passed all those sorts of reliefs when it comes to regulatory, litigation, taxation, you name it. We passed the reforms that said the best thing we can do for businesses, particularly small businesses in the state, more often than not is get government out of the way. And there's times we can be partners, but more often than not it's just getting government out of the way. And if we create a better business environment in the state, one that the employers of the state, one that the consumers of the state, and really for that matter, one that job creators across the country are looking at, we ultimately are going to have a state that puts more people to work. You know, sometimes there's a lot of folks, and occasionally we hear voices here or there that think that the government creates jobs. Government doesn't create jobs. People do. People like you create jobs. We're going to make it easier in the days and months and years to come for all of you, particularly small businesses, to create more jobs in the state of Wisconsin. We have a goal that was clearly laid out last year when I was running for governor to help the people of this state create 250,000 new jobs in Wisconsin. 250,000 new jobs. Not in government, not through the hands of government, not through bills that specifically create jobs, but by creating a better business environment so that the people of the state can create more jobs. And while I and Paul and Rebecca and others would go out and do cartwheels if we could find a company or business that was going to bring 1,000 or 5,000 or 2,500 jobs at a time, the simple reality is we're not going to do that 1,000 or even 500 jobs at a time. We're going to do it 5 and 10 and 25 jobs at a time as our small businesses here in Wisconsin feel confident in taking that risk and making that investment and getting the access to capital and finding the marketplace to put more people to work in our state. That's why it was so important, after getting the updates from Rebecca, after holding similar sessions myself, for us to hold this session, the first of hopefully many to come into the future, where we share, and not just through my comments today, but through what you've already heard from our cabinet, what you'll hear from other cabinet members and what you hear from other businesses about how to help your business grow here in the state of Wisconsin. Now, in addition to the things we specifically did to make it easier to create jobs in the private sector here in Wisconsin, our reforms overall are working and it's helping business as well. I mean, think about it. Not only do we create a better business environment for the people of the state, but we also create an environment of greater stability. Because what do I hear time and time again? I just heard it from folks from Manitowoc and Sheboygan County, where I was just at a session just about an hour and a half ago. The biggest single challenge I hear from job creators is certainty. The lack of certainty in the marketplace. And to the degree that we can help as a partner create more certainty, at least in the interaction that small businesses have with state and local government, we can help you be willing and able to take that risk to invest in capital that puts more people to work. That's what this is all about here today. And that's why I'm glad to tell you that our reforms work beyond just those numbers for the job climate, the business climate in the state. It's also working in providing stability. You see, we took the beginning of this year a $3.6 billion budget deficit and turned it into a budget that now has a budget surplus. And we did it the old-fashioned way, the way you do it in your own business. You know, we didn't grab for funds from somewhere. We didn't take federal stimulus money that was one time and put it into ongoing concerns. Instead, we made tough structural decisions that ultimately put not only our state but our local governments back in a better position. for us, if we look at not only balancing the budget, doing it in a way that provides structural changes, we did things that I like to say, having 2 kids of my own, we did things that thought more about the next generation than we did about the next election. And that's important not just overall, that's important to business. You see, I remember back in February and March, I was doing all sorts of interviews with newspapers and TV stations from across the state, and occasionally I talked to outlets from outside of Wisconsin. And one day I was sitting in the conference room in the Capitol adjacent to my office, and there was a reporter there from Reuters. And the guy said to me, he said, you know, the people who read our publication like stability. They're investors. They like stability. He could hear some of the same sorts of voices you just heard a minute ago around the Capitol, and he said, you know, how do you say to them that this is stable? And I said, well, that's really actually a pretty insightful question. That's a great question. But I'll tell you, your premise is 180 degrees wrong. You see, what we saw there, and you see occasionally here or there around the state, is temporary political instability. It's temporary political instability. What it has led to is permanent structural stability in our finances, in our government. What we're doing has saved our state and our local districts, our local governments and our school districts hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. Money that just down the way in Kaukauna, they're using to take a $400,000 deficit and turn it into a surplus of over $1 million that they're using to hire more teachers, to lower classroom size, to set money aside to pay based on merit. Whether it's a big city or a small town, whether it's a school district or a town or a county or village, places all across Wisconsin have used these reforms not only to balance their budget, but to do so in a way that provides long-term structural relief so that they don't face the kind of consequences we've been facing the last couple of years. That means a more stable government, and that means a more stable place to live in, to work in, and to create jobs here in the state of Wisconsin. And when we do that, it makes it easier for all of you to add jobs. It makes it easier to provide confidence not only in the marketplace but in consumers out there, because they understand, unlike other states like Illinois to the south, and they're not just burdened with the fact that their team's the Chicago Bears instead of the Green Bay Packers. The simple reality is they took a different course earlier this year. You know, they were faced with some of the same challenges Wisconsin had. Nearly every state across America was faced with a budgetary challenge like Wisconsin's. We saw fit to address it differently. In Illinois, they raised taxes on businesses by 46% earlier this year. They raised taxes on individuals by 67%. Remember what happened? I thought it would happen a year later. Instead of a year later, it was 6 months later. They had lost so many jobs, so much wealth, so many businesses that they literally had to come back and face up to an $8 billion budget deficit. They're in the days now where they're literally looking at laying off thousands of public employees in the state of Illinois and closing something like 7 or 8 of their state facilities down there because they didn't have the courage to make the tough but needed decisions that put them back on track. They have a pension system down there that's half funded. They have a debt rating that's the 49th worst. If it weren't for California, they'd be in a league of their own. In Wisconsin, for our state employees, we have a 100% funded pension system. We have a bond rating that was assured. In fact, the bond rating agencies, one of them, called our budget credit positive. That's the kind of stability you want out of your state and local government if you're going to make a long-term commitment to grow your business here in the state of Wisconsin. So the reforms are working to create a better business environment. They're working when it comes to saving our budgets and putting our budget back on the right track. They're also working in an area that many of you as small business owners can particularly relate to, not just in overall taxes, but for so many of us having property taxes both as individual and as commercial landowners. One of the great things about this budget as well is we essentially freeze property taxes in nearly every part of the state of Wisconsin for the next 2 years. In a time when you're facing an economic challenge, at a time when every penny you have, you need to either pay the bills or use it to hire, maybe that opportunity to hire 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more employees. You need to put that money back into your business, not into higher property taxes, not into higher cost out there. And so we're thrilled that our budget also allows us to essentially freeze property taxes for the next 2 years. But I think the most important thing, the thing that is you look ahead and you look and say, where do I want to invest in? Not only do I want to invest in a place that creates a better business environment, I want to invest in a state that's got its act together and a state where I get value out of the investment I make. So for the taxes you do pay, as much as we want to keep them under control, you want to live in a state where there's value out of that. That's what I hear time and time again from people, whether small business owners or just individual residents. They say, you know, the taxes are too high, but I wouldn't mind paying part of them if I actually thought I got some value out of it. And so the most important thing I think out of reforms is now we can change the way we operate state and local governments. You see, we get to hire and fire based on merit. No longer tenure or seniority or anything else out there. That doesn't trump it. I mean, think about this. A year ago, about this time, there's a young woman in the Milwaukee area who was named the Outstanding Teacher of the Year by one of the statewide teachers associations. A week later, she got a pink slip. Why? Because she was one of the last ones hired, so she was one of the first ones out. That's what happens when you have a contract that says seniority and tenure trumps over anything else. Not in this system. The way we reform things now, our schools and our local and our state government can hire and fire based on merit. We can pay based on performance, which ultimately means we can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms and in our government positions all across the state of Wisconsin. That's important because long term, that means we're actually going to be able to perform for the people of Wisconsin. You all know in your own businesses, how do you get performance out of your employees? More often than not, probably in every or nearly every business here, you do it by rewarding excellence. You have great employees who do great things for you, who are good in sales, good in excellence, good in quality, good in controlling your costs. You reward them. You find some way to compensate them based on performance. For years, that's been foreign in government. Not any longer. Merit pay and paying for performance is something that allows us to make sure that our government is going to be fundamentally better for the people that we serve all across the state of Wisconsin. And that's good not just for government. That's not just good as residents and constituents. That's ultimately good for businesses because you want a government that performs. I hope you've seen already today with the cabinet members you've heard from and others you'll hear from later today that we understand that task. We're up to that task. It's why, earlier about a year ago at this time, not long after the elections, I know the media was a little frustrated with me because traditionally the governor-elect dribbles out about one each week a new cabinet member. I waited till the very end of December before I released my cabinet. The media couldn't understand why. They want, it's kind of a manufactured way to create a story. They said, well, why is that? I said, well, the business leaders I talk to talk about how fundamentally important it is to have a good management team around you, right? A lot of you probably tell me, as I've heard across, you say, well, great job with your company. You say, well, no, it's not me. It's my team here. It's the team of people that help me put together a great effort. Well, in my case, we wanted to make sure we had the right team, not just good people, but people that fit, that personalities that fit within an agency, that fit within the cabinet, that fit within our mission. And so I think you'll see we have probably one of the best teams when it comes to a cabinet of any team across America. Because we waited to do it the way you would do it in the business world. We fit the right people with the right talent to fit the right time and the right moment in our state's history. And so whether it's the DNR or the Economic Development Corporation, whether it's the Department of Tourism or DATCAP or anywhere in between, we have state agencies that are designed to serve you. And we understand, in fact, one of our cabinet members, it was kind of funny, after the first couple meetings, I kept saying over and over again, everything we do has got to be about what does this do to help the people of Wisconsin create 250,000 new jobs? And finally, I said it so often, one of our cabinet members got up after a weekend on a Monday morning meeting, and he said, well, Governor, I just want to let you know, over the weekend I got a tattoo, and it says 250,000 jobs on my arm. I said, that's great, but you obviously weren't listening close enough because I went across your forehead. For us, it just showed that every state agency, not just the ones you expect, the Economic Development Corporation, workforce development, WIDA, all those are important, but every state agency, whether it's dealing with licenses and regulation, whether it's dealing with public safety, whether it's dealing with financial institutions, every state agency is committed, the leadership we put in place is committed to help all of you and all the rest of the small business leaders of the state have an easier path towards creating jobs in the state. Now, that doesn't mean we ignore public safety or public health. We want that as much as anyone. We want clean air and clean water and clean land, but we understand that achieving those objectives does not have to fall in the face of economic prosperity in the state. That's important for us. And so you have our commitment that we're going to, every day, we're looking to make every day, every week, every month better for small businesses here in the state of Wisconsin. Now, that's part of a great tradition in the state. You may think about it. When we think about talking about our budget early this year and the fiscal restraint we tried to put in place that you've all been doing in the small business world for years, I thought back to the fact that this isn't a new concept. You see, back in 1848, when we approved the state's constitution on the second try that spring, before we became a state in May of that year, if you look back at the Constitution, I did last year again when I took my oath of office and gave an inaugural address, I actually referenced part of that state constitution. Why? Because where it talks about spending, one of the things that's interesting is there's something called the frugality clause. It's never been amended, never been altered in all the years we've been a state. It talks about how moderation and frugality in government leads to freedom and prosperity for our people. Think about that. When it comes to spending, they said moderation and frugality in government leads to freedom and prosperity for our people. Why I think what we're doing is so important. It's important here in Wisconsin. It's important across America because what I've seen in our history, both in Wisconsin and certainly as a nation, for more than 200 years as a nation, when there have been times of economic crisis, of fiscal crisis, military crisis, we've had men and women in this country who were leaders who were willing to stand up and put the future of their children and their grandchildren ahead of their own political futures. And that's what we're doing here in Wisconsin. We're thinking about the future. We're thinking about the next generation. We're trying to make it easier for all of us to pass on a Wisconsin even greater than the one that we inherited. That's why it's such an honor to serve as your governor and to come and talk to people who are at the forefront of putting people to work each and every day here in the state of Wisconsin. Now, I've got one last request for you. You know, I look around and I saw a lot of nods, I saw some smiles, I see some reflections of people who say, yeah, that makes sense. Some of the observers here today might say, well, of course, you know, you're preaching to the choir. You're talking to a bunch of small business owners. Of course they're going to like that. You talk about regulatory relief, tax relief, litigation relief. You talk about all these things. Of course small businesses are going to like that. Well, sometimes when people say you're preaching to the choir, I remind them, my dad, a long time ago, since retired, but my dad, I grew up in a small town called Delavan. My dad was a minister, and one of his colleagues, another minister in town, was once asked, Pastor, why do you preach to the choir? He said, it's real simple. I preach to the choir because I want the choir to sing. Right? Why do you preach to the choir? You preach to the choir because you want the choir to sing. So today, after you hear the rest of the panels, after you hear the rest of the discussions, as you go back home or you go back to work or you're back to work tomorrow or you're back at the chamber next week, you talk to folks at church on Sunday, wherever you're at, you go to a trade association meeting somewhere else across the country, what I need from everybody assembled here today, if you agree with the path we've charted out for the future of this state, a path that's going to help us towards more economic freedom and prosperity. If you agree with that, I need you to be a part of our choir. I need you to sing, to tell that message, because I can put up signs and I can put up bumper stickers and billboards and everything else, but nothing matches someone who's respected in their community, in their industry, in their profession. Here in Wisconsin or anywhere across the country, nothing matches your personal testimony, your singing about the wonders of what's happening here in the state of Wisconsin and how it's making it easier for you and others like you to create jobs here in Wisconsin. That's what we need to get this state working again. You know, we had great growth the first 6 months of this year, and then we hit a wall just like nearly every other state did in July and August into September because of all the nonsense out in Washington with the debt. It's like a big wet blanket on the state's economy. I'm convinced we have to find a way to punch through that wet blanket and show that Wisconsin can once again lead the way towards economic prosperity. With your help, with your focus, with your determination, with your willingness to sing for us, we'll do just that. Thank you so much for having us here today.